In the last video, we were looking at this idea of judging whether something's ethical or not based upon the consequences, and covered the idea of ethical egoism, which says the ethical thing for you to do is the thing that maximizes your long-run self-interest. In this particular video, we extend that idea to a different theory, utilitarianism. Now, this theory is one that most people will be familiar with, even if they're not familiar with its actual name, utilitarianism. So let's get into it and see what we're actually talking about. Whereas ethical egoism was really talking about what's best for you or the self, utilitarianism extends that and says the moral thing is the decision or action that maximizes the overall good for everyone, right? So you're really judging the consequences, the effects on everyone affected by the decision. And the thing that sums all of the goodness up, the net best thing, that is the thing that is ethical. And the other options, the ones that aren't as good, are unethical. It's really important to keep making that point. You have to do this under this theory, otherwise you're being unethical. So what that means is you have to predict and analyze the happiness or the good, or in economic terms, the utility. So economists use this term utility. Why do they use the term utility? When I say happiness, you get this idea in your head, like it might be having a good time, right? It might be a positive event. But there are things like, I don't know, washing machines. Now, I don't get particularly happy around my washing machine. Well, maybe the first time I use it, but it doesn't make me feel good. But it has utility. It has usefulness. And in fact, my washing machine probably has more utility than a night at the pub. Even though I might feel better, even though I might describe the pub as I might be happier at the pub or good because of the pub. But we're not really talking about it in that sense when we're talking about happiness or good here. We're talking about utility, which can include things like going to the pub or going to a party or an ice cream party if you don't drink. But it also means things like a washing machine or a refrigerator or things that make our life better. And you'll notice utility, that's where the name comes from. That's why it's called what it is, because it's about this idea of maximizing benefit. So the action that results in the highest positive benefit for all those involved is the morally right one. And you must take that action. It is wrong to take any other action. Morally wrong. When we're talking about utilitarianism, we're worried about the consequences and only the consequences. We don't care how we achieve that outcome. We also are going beyond our own happiness or utility, and we're not giving it extra weight. Each person affected has equal weighting in this system. No special weight for you like under ethical egoism. And what we mean by utility is very broad. So there are various versions of utility. It's been around for a long time. We're going to concentrate on the traditional or classic approach that looks to maximize overall utility. But later developments include things like rule utilitarianism, right? Rule utilitarianism doesn't focus on the act or decision, but it focuses on a rule or principle that will result in maximizing overall good. It's subtly different. No need to go there. Just realize that things have moved on from what I'm going to describe, but I think this is foundational and you should understand what underpins this approach and later developments. Because the logic of this classical or traditional approach is what applies to these newer derivatives, so it underpins it. I think it's important to have a little bit of an understanding about history to help us understand many of these topics, and utilitarianism is no different. So utilitarianism springs really out of the Renaissance and the Reformation and the burgeoning sciences of the time. You can imagine people are developing calculus, mathematics, science is moving forward. And so even people like moral philosophers start to take this on board. In particular, Bentham and Mill in the 19th century start to think about things. And so essentially they start to try and apply mathematics to moral philosophy. And they use this to critique the social frameworks of the day. For instance, they would critique things like slavery, whether women were allowed to vote, etc. And they were using this theory to do it. They were using the net happiness of everyone involved as the approach and summing it up. So because they have this kind of new burgeoning tool of more advanced mathematics, they come up with some pretty complicated ways of thinking about it. So their first thing is to suggest we have to be able to measure happiness, right? Now, of course, happiness is subjective, right? You might like chocolate ice cream, I might like vanilla, and so therefore there's no one measure for chocolate ice cream. But I could get a measure from you and a measure from me and add them together. You might say it's 8 out of 10. I might say chocolate ice cream is 4 out of 10, right? And we could add them up. And that's essentially what they're doing. When faced with the outcome of this decision, how much happiness is there for you? Okay, so we got this single number, 8. We like chocolate ice cream, 8 out of 10. Now that's like a single number. How do you compare chocolate ice cream with being fit? One's are really transitory, you're just having one meal, etc. You've got to get it repeated. The other, being fit, is it affects your life in so many positive ways, etc. So how do we compare these? So as part of this, they developed something called the philosophic calculus, right? And what they were trying to do was think through the different factors that affect this score. And you can see that we have 7 here, right? So they came up with these 7 factors. First is intensity. How intense is the experience? The more intense, the higher the score. How long does the effect of this impact last? Is it long-lasting? For instance, if I lose the function of my arm for the rest of my life, that has a huge duration effect, etc. How certain am I of this outcome? Right? The more certain I am of the outcome, the higher the score. How remote is the outcome? So if it's going to happen tomorrow, it's probably higher than if it's going to happen in 5 years. These next two are interesting, fecundity and purity. Fecundity is an old word that really is knock-on effects. So if I go to the gym, why do I go to the gym? I probably go to the gym to get healthy, right? Maybe I want to get fit. Just how I said I want to get fit. Well, fitness is one thing, but if I go to the gym and I get fit, then I probably get healthy. If I go to the gym and I get fit, I probably lose weight. If I'm fit and healthy and I lose weight and I'm at the gym and I'm meeting people, I might become more attractive. I'm not saying too attractive, but you get the idea, right? There are these positive spillover effects of going to the gym. So that's what fecundity is. Are there positive spillover effects that occur as a result of this decision or action? Purity, and I'm not sure why they called it this, purity is the opposite, is are there negative? Are there negative consequences? I could eat a Big Mac and fries tonight, and I could get like a short, intense, but really the purity elements of it is I might get a sugar rush, I start feeling bad, I have too many calories, I start putting on weight, maybe it makes my breath bad. You get the idea that this purity is this issue of negative spillover effects of your behaviour. I think smoking would be a great example of where you have negative spillover effects of smoking, multiple of them, and that would bring your score down. So you've got to think about not only the immediate thing, but what's going to flow on from that in this fecundity and purity dimensions. And then finally, number 7 is an important one, is the extent. And that's more or less the number of people affected. Think of it that way. How many are affected by that? And that has a huge impact on the score, as we'll go through. So this idea of measuring happiness is quite complex. I don't think you need to understand this in detail. Just realize what the people behind this theory were actually thinking about, that you could measure all this and you could think through the consequences and then you could calculate it and work out some way to come up with this number for the impact of eating chocolate ice cream. 8. That's where that 8 comes from, actually working through all these dimensions with a person. So, as we did with ethical egoism, what we say is we've got option A and option B, and what we need to do is we need to estimate the increase or decrease in pleasure or pain experienced by each individual under option A. So you have person 1, person 2, person 3, you need to identify them, and you say under option A, well, they go up 8 points. And under option B, they will be the same. And person 2 will go down 2 points under option A, and under option B, they might go up 3 points. And person 3, just say there are only 3 people affected, they go up 4 points of utility. And under option B, they go minus 1 point. So what you can see is under option A, there are 10 total utility points, and under option B, there are 2 utility points. What that means is that the ethical thing to do is option A, because the total utility is maximised under that options, the net utility. Again, I want to stress, this means you are morally obliged to do this action. Doing B would be unethical in this situation. Now, there is a big misconception about this calculation, and it's because some of the definitions that you say are a little confusing, right? This approach, maximising net utility, is not about the decision that makes the most people better off. Now, most of the time that's what's going to happen, right? But that's not the decision rule, right? If you make one person a lot better off and several people a tiny little bit worse off, such that the positive for this one person outweighs the negative for all these people, the thing to do is to do the action that maximises for this person. Because the net utility, not the number of people, the net utility is what matters. Of course, in the real world, if a lot of people are affected, it's probably going to drive net utility that way. So they correlate a lot, but it's not the decision rule. Let's have a more detailed look at some of the intricacies behind this calculation. Okay, so this calculation includes positives and negatives, right? You can have negative utility, it makes you worse off. So you can think of it as you've got to account for the pleasure and the pain that are included in the calculation. And we're not just looking at an individual stakeholder or person, but the changes between groups. As I was mentioning, the number of people doesn't matter. It's not directly relevant. It matters only that it drives the net utility score. And from the felicific calculus, that's the dimension of extent that we talked about earlier. Let me give you an example mathematically just to show how this works. You have 100 people who are going to suffer a minor inconvenience, so their utility is going to go down 0.1. And you have one person whose utility is going to go up 5 points. So the net utility of these 100 people is -1. The net utility of this person is 5. So the net over these 101 people is +4. So if you said, okay, if we move from situation A to situation B, so we're in situation A, do we move to B? So do I implement an AI policy? I go from A to B. We have no AI policy. I'm going to implement an AI policy. Is it ethical? Okay, well, 100 people are going to have a minor inconvenience, say they can't use Grammarly. So they're going to go 1. This one person, for some reason, they get very worried about other people using AI. So they want to be very clear on what the policy is. They go up 5 points of utility. So even though only one person really wanted it, I should do it. Because over the entire group, over the 101 individuals, net utility goes up 4 if I make this change. That's what this statement is actually saying. Now, as you can see in this, it's not that this one person is more heavily weighted, it's just that they get more utility from it. So we do consider everyone equal. Everyone's utility score is considered equal. We don't weight anyone's utility score. I also should emphasise that while I haven't done it in this example, you really should think about the short-term and long-term consequences, just like we did in ethical egoism. It's very easy to concentrate on the short term, but we've got to look at these long-term effects, which Bentham was trying to capture in that dimension of duration back that I described earlier. And we've got to look for these knock-on effects that I spent some time on, fecundity and purity. Oh my goodness, that sounds very complicated. And it is and it isn't. What you're theoretically doing is going around to each person and say, hey, if we make this decision or make this change, what's going to happen to your utility/happiness? And they're going to go, I think it's +5. And then I go to the next person, +3. Next person, -2. Next person. And then I get all those scores and add them together. And if it's positive, I do it. If it's negative, I don't. That's what's going on. In the real world, you can't go around to everyone. So how do we do it? Well, in business, what we would tend to do is to say that there are groups of people with similar interests who are affected in a similar way. So what we try and do is identify these stakeholding groups. Students are affected this way. Staff are affected this way in a university decision. They're not going to have the same utility. In reality, even individuals within this are going to vary. But imagine that on average, we can come up with an average score for this group. So we get the group, we develop a list of the consequences for that group, positive and negative generally, and then we think about what the effect on their utility will be. We think about those dimensions Bentham have to make sure we don't overweight the short term or the long term, that we think about the knock-on effects, that we think about how long it's going to last, how close it is. We also importantly look at the extent, we look at the number of people in that stakeholding group. So we might think on average a person putting all these positives and negatives together has a score of X, and there are 100 of them. So therefore the net utility is 100X. If there were 200, it would be 200X. So you get the idea? So we do the stakeholders, we work out the utility for each, we multiply that by the number of people to get a net score, then we add it all up. And at the end, the thing that has the biggest score is the ethical thing to do. So here is a super simple example. Imagine you've got a group assignment. It's you with 3 other people, person A, person B, person C, and you find out person A and person B are very lazy, and you're going to have to constantly follow them up, review their work, even if they do anything. C isn't highly motivated, but they're going to do a bit better work than A and B. But it's not going to be as good as the quality of work you're going to do. Now, I'm not saying this is a real-world situation. Might be familiar to some people. Anyway. Now consider, you've got 3 options doing this group assignment. Number 1, you do everything. Now, to some degree, that's not what you're asked to do. And to some degree, if you do this, are you lying? I mean, there's a question mark there, right? You can do all the work. You can do most of the work with some help from C, the person who's a little bit better motivated. Or you could run the project where everyone has to contribute, where you're going to constantly be on A and B producing this lesser quality work. Now imagine you want a grade of 7. So you say, well, what would be my utility if I want to get a 7 for this assignment? You're a high-performing student. You want a 7. So if I have to go to the effort of making everyone contribute, my utility of getting a 7 will be 3 because it's so much more effort, right? I don't get as much utility from the 7 because it took so much out of me. Whereas if I just do the work, I actually have more utility. It's easier for me if I just do all the work. Maybe I have the same level of utility when I get C to help me. What about A? Person A, the lazy so-and-so who doesn't do any work and produces poor work. If they don't have to do any work, they get quite a lot of utility, 6 out of 10. Same for B, right? Can you see here? These 3 people, if you do all the work, option 1, their utility is high. They're going to get a 7 and do no work. Whereas if you make them work, option 3, everyone contributes equally, you can see their utility drops. Because they're going to get a 7, right, under each option. They just have to work for it now. So their utility for doing it this way is lower. And then, of course, we have in between. You know, what's the utility of the 2 people? In fact, I think I have this utility score wrong. It should actually be, this one should be 7, and this one should be 4. Right? If you make C do the work, their utility is going to be lower. These 2 are largely unchanged because they don't have to work. That's lower. You're about the same. Okay. So once we've worked out the utility for each of the people involved under each scenario, we add it up to get a total net utility score. So the net utility for the 4 people in this group, if you do all the work and get a 7, is 25. The net utility, if everyone has to work and you get a 7, is lower. It's 16. And why? Because it's harder for everyone and harder for you, keeping them all on track. And then option 2, where you get one group member to help you, is in between. So under this scenario, if this were true, the only ethical course, the ethical thing to do, is you do the work. Despite the fact you're really potentially undermining the purpose of the task. Because what matters is the consequence. What matters is the overall net utility, not how you achieve it. Okay, so just to reiterate, what matters is the total net utility score. You're morally required to do it yourself. 2 or 3 don't maximise net happiness or net utility, and so they are morally worse than you doing the assignment of yourself. Notice it doesn't matter about the distribution of the happiness. Under option 3, the net utility is more evenly distributed but lower. Distribution doesn't matter. Net total is what matters. Also, as I emphasised just before, it doesn't matter how you did it. It doesn't matter about whether it's fair or breaks the rules of the assignment. You only consider the effects of what you're doing. Now, there's a lot of positives in this utilitarian approach. You're looking at multiple people, right? Not just yourself, so you're considering the effect on everyone as part of it. Gives you a pretty definitive rule. You are worried about what happens to people and the consequences of those actions. So there are a lot of positives to the approach, and it's very clear and can give you a very direct answer. But all our theories, there are some drawbacks. The first key drawback is, how do you measure happiness? Right? There's no agreement about different kinds of utility. How do I compare my happiness to yours? How do I compare the high from a drug with winning a sporting competition in terms of happiness on a scale? Can you even really do that? Second, there's a whole series of uncertainty around this. It can be hard to identify all the stakeholders, right? How do you really know who's going to be affected? And can you even identify them? And can you understand their net utility out of it? Often there are all these unintended consequences that occur. In terms of our assignment example, we judge that utility based upon the idea that no one found out that it was only one person doing it and breaking the rules. If that gets discovered, suddenly all the utility scores change. So there's a whole lot of uncertainty in life that is very difficult to incorporate into a true utilitarian analysis. And as a result, the figures that we get, I had a supervisor once who talked about something called spurious accuracy. What he means is it looks highly scientific and it looks very objective, but underpinning it are a lot of kind of guesses and subjective assessments and things. So it looks super accurate and objective, but really it's not. As well as those practical problems, from an ethical perspective, there's a number of difficulties. First, the theory's like super strict. So what we might consider acceptable really are unethical. For instance, you should never go on a holiday ever again. Why? Because you could spend those dollars helping the poor. They would get more utility. Their utility would go up more than the loss of utility you get from your holiday. So therefore, you shouldn't spend money on that ethically. You should give it all to the poor. And I'm not sure even the strongest utilitarianists could live with that kind of logic. There are limits to how much we could give away in life under the strict application of the rule. So if you apply the theory strictly, you lead to some outcomes which are very, very difficult to live with. A second thing is that if you just focus on the outcome and the calculation, there are things that most people would consider unethical, such as oppression, may be morally required. For instance, if one person suffers 100 units of pain when tortured, but 110 other people each gain 1 unit of pleasure, then the torture from a moral perspective would be required. Not even acceptable, but you have to torture the person. So it's this kind of outcome, oppression of the minority, comes from this kind of approach because you overweight what the majority wants without taking account of the effect on the minority. Which means, of course, that you don't care how the utility is distributed. And I think really this is one of the key criticisms people have of some economic systems is that some people benefit too much, that the utility isn't distributed well enough. And that becomes a critique of this overall approach to ethical decision-making. Okay, so that's utilitarianism, but what about utilitarianism in business? Well, you're probably never going to run across the term in business, but what you will run across is this term cost-benefit analysis. That's really turning utility into dollars, working out who's badly affected, who's positively affected, particularly if you're doing an analysis of government policy. And then you say, okay, do the benefits, the pluses, outweigh the costs? If so, we should do it. What you're really doing is a utilitarian analysis, a relaxed form of utilitarian analysis. And so it has the positives, right? You've got this objective, unbiased calculation and a way to look and judge the effects, but it suffers from all of those problems that we talked about before. It can seem more objective than what it really is. You can oppress the minority. You can not look at the distribution of the utility amongst those involved. But it is a cornerstone of business practice and judging whether or not you should do something. Whew. I know that was a long video, but it's a pretty integral theory. There's some complexity to it. But at the same time, it is a reasonably simple approach that's widely adopted in business. So hopefully you've got an understanding of the utilitarian approach to working out what's ethical. In the next video, we're going to stop thinking about consequences and start thinking about what you're actually doing with deontological approaches to ethical decision making.